Hello everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm thinking this morning about Owen Barfield's book, Saving the Appearances, a study in idolatry. And the subtitle has to do with us moderns having developed something like idols in consciousness, particularly due to the fact that for most of us, much of the time as adults, we live in a world of representations. These are tags and concepts in language that stand for the things that we think we are recognizing in awareness: a tree, a chair, a process, a quality, a color, a sound. And in our modern experience, we aren't having a lot of experience. Mostly what we're having is representations and thinking about the relationships between them. Experience itself begins as participated. In childhood, before we've developed representational lexicons, before we've adopted and been scripted by the representations of our modernity and culture, we're having something a bit more like dreaming in waking consciousness, and this is why children are so profoundly imaginative and playful. We are told that we grow out of this. That is not what happens. What happens is that layers of representational cognition at first leak in and are wiped away at night when we dream, but eventually there's enough structure left over from dreaming that the construction of a represented world and universe and so on becomes trenchant and eventually evicts the dreaming faculty and the faculties of dreaming from our waking world experience. And this, for many of us, becomes the death of our imagination, unless we find some way to continue to play imaginatively in the waking world. And this is often preserved or accomplished by what we call art, right? Theater, music, singing, dancing, sometimes writing, although writing is a bit more representational or pseudo-left hemispheric. And so in childhood we undergo a process that I think is signified by the story in the Bible of Cain and Abel, where Cain kills Abel, evicting Abel to the underworld. This story is echoed in a broad number of cultures, including American Indian cultures, in the Navajo Beauty Way traditions. The two children are called Slayer of Alien Gods, Cain, and Little Water of the Moon, Abel. In the same way that in the Bible, hevel means a puff of vapor, right? Little Water of the Moon is thought of as vaporous. And that means a changing, transforming manifold of possible identity, meaning, and activity. In Barfield's book, he begins by talking about the rainbow, because it's one of the few phenomenon that we may experience directly which nearly requires participation, or what he means by participation, to experience, because clearly the rainbow is not literally there. In fact, it's not really in a place at all. It's in the between of origin and minds. And this is one of the features that makes the rainbow so fascinating. Yes, a machine can detect a rainbow, but it's a matter of point of view in relation to water, sunlight, other light, so on. he calls figuration the process of non-participated recognition. Again, I won't go deeply into what participation means, but it means something that resembles how children are in the world, but much more advanced versions of this or forms of this in adult minds, tribal consciousness and tradition, ceremony, and so on. These are forms of participation that are largely lost to us moderns. We rarely have experiences of them, and one of the reasons that psychedelic drugs are so important and popular is that it's very difficult to, one might say that psychedelic drugs force our consciousness into a state resembling, not the same as, but resembling original participation. So he calls figuration the process of recognizing and relating with objects, situations, circumstances, and so on, according to our modern representations. And the problem with that is that they are dead inside. They're not, there's no habitable space in there for our psyche, our spirit, our vital mind, and so on. In this sense, knowledge, what we think of as knowledge, is dead to origin. It does not include any upscale, originary features other than the universe and physics, right? And those are basically mechanical, utilitarian mechanical models of cause and effect that enable us to predict things with very high degrees of accuracy, certain kinds of things. Now, originally, okay, let me just continue with a couple of other key terms. He calls alpha thinking the process of thinking in representational cognition about the representations and their relationships to each other, how they transform each other, and so on. Alpha thinking is a great deal of what we do. If we go to the store, if we're doing any pragmatic activity, it is the primary mode of thinking that science is and utilizes. And then he presents beta thinking, which is the kind of thing I'm doing right now, as thinking about our minds, consciousness, how we navigate in thought, understanding, figuring things out, and effectively thinking about our psyche, any kind of reflection on the nature of mind and consciousness. So figuration is recognition according to representational overlays that we've developed, that have been developed over time and are transmitted generation to generation in language, thought, culture, society, and so on. Alpha thinking is thinking about the representations themselves and their relationships in representational thought. And beta thinking is thinking about consciousness, the mind, how we relate with representations, participation, original participation, and so on. Now it turns out that in his view, a view that I think is very valuable, archaic thought was fundamentally different from ours in that it was a form of thought that arose from the direct experience of original participation in the world, phenomena, and relationships. Our kind of thought is mostly not like this. In fact, it's anathema to that kind. And it turns out that if we're thinking carefully, there is a deadly problem with the idea of knowledge. Knowledge will eventually become representational for human beings, as it has for us, more so than in any other generation of mankind thus far, less so than it will be in the near-term future, partly due to the onset of scientific modes of thinking, and particularly technology, specifically computers. So it turns out that knowledge, right, we hear in the Genesis story, there are two trees in the garden, you shouldn't eat from one of them because it is death. And then of course Eve in this story goes to the tree and there's a serpent there. Probably what is meant by that is an angel, and probably the angel that divides things. It makes cuts in manifolds the same way that our representational cognition does. So we cut from origin to the universe, to something, to thing, being, function, relationship, to organisms, right? That's a being, to plants, vegetal beings, to tree, to apple tree, to apples, right? These are the cuts that we make in the manifold of identity whenever we consider something specifically. So Eve meets the angel of dividing things. They have a conversation. The angel says, well, you won't really die. You'll be able to make stuff. You'll become a maker, right? Because the one who cuts determines identity by the cuts they make. Now there's a lot of rich backstory here that I don't have time to go into, but effectively, knowledge, as we experience representational knowledge at least, is dead to origin, right? To where all beings descend from. Yeah, whether that's the universe in a purely mechanical idea, or whether it's a being like God, or whether it's a being that's outside of our common classifications or beings that inhabit time-space and the between of all beings in consciousness and intelligence. Knowledge is dead inside, particularly representational knowledge. It's not habitable the way original participation and the thoughts that emerge from minds engaged in that was. Now, in order to understand a little bit about what the archaic mind was, it wasn't exactly symbolic. It was more analogical in a sense, so that, for example, I'll give a few examples. But first, I want to talk about the difference between a representation and participation. So, the idea of money is to value itself, right? Kind of anathema, right? It collapses all forms of value into a tokenized representation that can be exchanged. And this partly occludes participation from us. This is the kind of representation that happens when original participation dies. Everything becomes commodities, pictures, photographs, social media videos. People represent themselves rather than being themselves for the sake of garnering audience and perhaps opportunities and cash. So, money is to value as representational thought, our kind, is to our original participation, right? And in the archaic mind, everything that we could experience, you have to throw away the whole idea of causality. Cause and effect has nearly nothing to do with how ancient people were likely to have thought and experienced their world. Let me give you some examples, at least one, of analogies. So, as bees are to flowers, nectar and honey, something is to minds, relationships, and death, right? Or birth, both. And as bees are to flowers and honey, something is to worlds, right? So there's something, you can see there's a multi-order, a multi-ordinal ladder of identity, so that what we see down here are down here on Earth, right, in material existence, are analogies of things in the origin world, which is usually thought of as the sky. So this mode of thinking is radically different from most of what we moderns do, and leads to identity sets that are completely different from those we are familiar with. This is why it is very confusing for moderns to encounter tribal peoples and to see how they have arranged the spiral of analogic relationships in the physical world and the relational world, radically different from the purposes for which we use representational thought. They are capable of thought, they are capable of forming linked families of qualities, properties, identities, and so on, but they do not do it according to the weird logics we use. Rather, they do it according to experiences of deep participation and the sort of dreaming-like results of those experiences. The topic is very rich and deep. I merely wanted to introduce a few features that were in my mind at the moment. Particularly, however, it's very important to understand that there's something that stands in the opposite position of what we experience as knowledge, and it's a form of insight that sees all of the features of our experience as representative of features of the universe, origin, dreaming, and participated relation. And knowledge, as we understand it, though there are forms of knowledge that can be participated, dreaming is one of them that's common to all of us, but you can see that dreaming is nothing like the waking mind. There are the figures that we see in the waking mind, but the dreamer's experience of those figures is fundamentally different, and it's participated rather than represented in consciousness. And so we live in a time where our knowledge is profuse but dead inside. And this is, I think, what was meant, something in this direction was meant in the very small fragment of what was probably a larger book in Genesis, where we hear of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, though first we hear, stay away from the tree of knowledge. By the way, that tree, when God says in the Bible, when it is said that God says, do not eat of the tree in the midst of the garden, that word midst appears to come from a Hebrew root tavek, which means to put apart, to part, right? It doesn't really mean in the middle of. And this is analogous, right? If we were thinking in the old way, we would think, oh, it means the umbilicus of the earth, or Eden, right? It's where Eden was cut away from heaven, something like this. A similar, just to give one more example of analogic thinking that is actually really important, our hand, one unifying body, 4 working members, 1 thinking member with 2 segments, is to our body, right, 4 working members with 3 segments, 1 thinking member with 2, unifying body, as our body is to origin, right? This is an example of the form of thought which was fundamentally metaphoric and analogical, that Barfield proposes archaic peoples experienced. So that's my brief introduction to some of the topics in Owen Barfield's Saving the Appearances, a book I profoundly recommend and am reading for probably the 5th time at the moment. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to spending time learning and exploring together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.